How's it going, everybody? It's Young here, and welcome to a Death Stranding analysis. If you've been keeping up with Death Stranding news, then you may be aware of the fact that recently, Kojima has been showing off the interior of his new studio, and among the things that stick out most about it is the presence of this mural, which seems to feature what could very well be new hints regarding Death Stranding. Last time, I focused on explaining these physics equations scribbled on the wall, all of which seem to further corroborate that Death Stranding will be making use of sci-fi elements like futuristic space travel, time travel, and theories of multiple worlds and dimensions. In this video, I would like to focus on the text here that is written in a foreign language. It didn't take long for the people of the internet to identify this to be an excerpt from a poem written by the late Swedish poet Werner von Heidenstam. You will also notice that inscribed right next to that is an excerpt from Auguries of Innocence, a poem written by English poet William Blake, the same bit of text featured in Death Stranding's first trailer. So I think it's safe to say that if this made it to the mural, then this Swedish poem will surely be very relevant to Death Stranding's story and themes as well. But before we can analyze it, we have to translate the Swedish text, and well, I can't read Swedish, but I did manage to find a translation from a Reddit user going by the name of Peter Sonerik, and what I did was essentially use a combination of his translation and some of the translation provided by Google Translate to formulate what I believe to be the best, most grammatically correct, and the most English-friendly version of the poem. Do keep in mind that the Swedish poem will probably not flow as well when translated into English, and some of the meaning might get lost, but as long as we have a general idea for what the message of the poem is trying to convey, the results should be satisfactory. Let's begin by only translating the text featured on Kojima's mural, which is only a small portion of the full poem, and it translates into English as follows. In both directions from your body span unimaginable miles away and tied together on the other side of the earth. Just from that portion alone, I think you will very quickly determine that the poem ties into one of Death Stranding's main themes, which is connections and strands that tie us all together, as well as the notion that things like distance are no obstacles for these kinds of connections. This theme of connection is part of the reason why the word stranding is in the game's title. Part of its meaning derives from the word strand, as in string or rope, so the word stranding could be replaced with roping or connecting, so death roping or death connecting, if you will. With that out of the way, let's now go ahead and translate the poem in its entirety and see what other ways the poem ties into the game. The full translation of the poem goes as follows. I know I don't belong here. I come from another time when the streets, where the gray water had the same form as us. Constantly running towards land, I turn around. I remember the cafe tables we sat. Every night felt so lukewarm and faithful to my path away. I was just as far away from the stars as the stars were from me. I crossed the Nile. I remember my hand on the railing, but I know I come from another time when you used to knock on my window, and I thought you stood gone before me. In both directions from your body span unimaginable miles away and tied together on the other side of the earth. I think about you as you think about someone who stayed up and watched over a lonely flower. I think about you as you think about someone who expected a lot from death. Nothing could come and knock it out of your arms. Right out of the gate, one of the first things in the full poem that sticks out to me is the fact that the subject of the poem seems to be stranded in another world. The poem literally opens with, I know I don't belong here, I come from another time. This excerpt not only reinforces the notion that Death Stranding may indeed make use of sci-fi concepts like time travel and multiple dimensions, it's also very reminiscent of how Kojima's assistant Ayako once tweeted the game to be about something that has been stranded from some world. So if you think about it, the Swedish poem features themes related to both meanings of the word stranding that the title of Kojima's new game references, one of them being connecting and the other being the more traditional definition, as in being stranded on an island or stranding on the beach. To take that a step further, the poem also encompasses the other word in the game's title, death, which is obviously going to be a big theme in Death Stranding. The most direct mention of death that can be found in the poem is when the subject says, "I think about you as you think about someone who expected a lot from death." To add to this, I also stumbled upon something interesting when I was reading up on this Swedish article in which the editor talks a bit about the author of the poem, Heidenstam. Right before presenting the full poem, the article mentions how Heidenstam was constantly haunted by thoughts of how death awaits us all and how death makes us all equal, or to word it another way, how death strands us all together, which represents the idea that all humans, no matter what their race, religion, nationality, etc., are all connected by the irrefutable fact that we're all mortals and that we all die in the end. This notion of death being the thing that connects or strands us all will, I think, be pivotal to Death Stranding, and I think this poem further corroborates this. I also believe this will all somehow tie into Kojima's intent to change the way we perceive the notion of death in video games. Based on what he said in the past, dying in the game won't result in a simple game over screen and a simple restart from the level's last checkpoint. There's going to be something unique about Death Stranding's death system that Kojima's keeping mum about. One last thing I would like to note about the poem, and this is purely my own speculation, is the possibility that the subject in the poem is actually dead. There's something about the way he's reminiscing, the way he says things like, "I come from a time when you used to knock on my window," and things like, "I crossed the Nile," that paint this picture in my head of a dead man reflecting on his time and connection with someone significant, as if they're stranding or connecting in death, if you will. Assuming that this interpretation is true, this might once again further tie into how Kojima intends to change the concept of death in video games and how dying in Death Stranding may yield results beyond a simple game over screen. Perhaps there's gameplay related to some kind of afterlife or whatever form death takes in Kojima's new world. Furthermore, maybe in Death, players will somehow be able to connect to other characters in the game, as well as other players as part of the game's online infrastructure. I don't know, I'm just wildly throwing out vague speculation out there at this point, but the big takeaway from all this is that this Swedish poem, when read in its entirety, seems to encompass all of the themes expressed by the title of Death Stranding. This poem expresses the idea of death, and how death strands us all together, the idea of being stranded in a place and time that one doesn't belong, and the idea of being connected despite being worlds apart. The poem is literally everything that the words death and stranding represent in Kojima's new game. It's almost eerie how perfectly the poem matches up with the game's themes. Perhaps this Swedish poem was one of Kojima's principal inspirations for his new title. At the very least, we know that the portion of the poem written on the wall will be important somehow, especially when you consider that it's written next to the excerpt from Auguries of Innocence that was featured in Death Stranding's first trailer. It's also worth mentioning that the two excerpts express some very similar meanings. In the case of the Swedish poem, which says, "In both directions from your body span unimaginable miles away and tied together on the other side of the earth," it talks about how a connection can't be severed by distance. And in the case of this excerpt from Auguries of Innocence, which reads, "To see the world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." It talks about the idea of worlds, universes, and infinity itself being as small as a grain of sand, fitting in as little room as the palm of your hand or a wild flower, and happening in as little as an hour, with concepts like distance and time being irrelevant when it comes to the idea that we're all connected in the grand scheme of the giant infinite puzzle that is existence itself. Let me put it this way, if we take this poem literally, a grain of sand might seem insignificant in size compared to us humans, but then you start asking questions like, how many atoms are in a grain of sand? Well, the answer to that will obviously vary from grain of sand to grain of sand, but on average, one grain of sand will be comprised of roughly 50 quintillion atoms. That's 19 zeros worth of atoms, or 50 millions of atoms. To us humans, such a number is incomprehensible, and yet such a number of atoms exist in an itty-bitty grain of sand. We could go even further and ask ourselves, within those 50 quintillion atoms in a grain of sand, how many subatomic particles are there? At which point the number would become so astronomical that we might as well call it infinity in a grain of sand. Here's something else to think about. When you think of a second, you think of this as one seemingly insignificant moment in time, right? But consider this. It takes 1,000 milliseconds to reach 1 second, but then it takes 1,000 microseconds to reach a millisecond, but then it takes 1,000 nanoseconds to reach a microsecond, and then it takes 1,000 picoseconds to reach a nanosecond, and we could literally go down this rabbit hole to infinity. So when you consider time in this form and from this perspective, there might as well be infinity in a second, and most definitely in an hour. Another way to think about it is that if we zoom out to a planetary level, each individual human is a mere speck of the Earth. There are 7.5 billion people on this planet, and yet we only occupy a small percentage of the planet's total surface area. And then you start to consider that compared to an entire galaxy, the Earth is but a mere speck of dust. And then we zoom out further and consider that compared to an entire universe, a galaxy is but a mere speck of dust. Even our galaxy is one among 100 billion galaxies, and that's just a rough estimate in the universe. Honestly, we could just keep going on and on and on and keep zooming in or out ad infinitum. So yeah, the message of those first 4 lines in Auguries of Innocence is very similar to what the excerpt from the Swedish poem conveys, just maybe on a larger scale. And that message is that time and distance play no part in the formation or severing of connections, especially human connections. And that's because if we zoom out far enough through the vast infinity of existence, you will realize that even worlds apart, we're not really very far from each other at all. We might as well be a world in a grain of sand, a heaven in a wild flower, infinity in the palm of a hand, and eternity in an hour. We are all connected, and but a speck of dust in the universe and the infinity beyond. And not to mention that connections is more than just about distance and time. It's about emotions and all these high-level concepts that us humans think about from time to time. So yeah, it's pretty deep actually when you think about it, and I definitely think this is what Kojima's trying to convey through the 2 poems written on this mural, and I believe they will heavily tie into the game's theme, story, and gameplay. Now, I've shared my 2 cents on the matter, so now I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. What do you think about the Swedish poem? What do you think it tells us about Death Stranding? And how do you expect it to tie into the game's story and gameplay? Let us know in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things Death Stranding, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out!